All right, guys, it's day 3 of Savor at Home. I've got Lucy in my lap right here. She's going to be tasting with me. Now, what we're trying today is a special request from my dad himself. We are trying Buffalo Trace, which is a Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey. It's 45% ABV, and this one is available pretty much everywhere. You should be able to get it at Trader Joe's, regular liquor stores, Publix. I don't know, we don't have Publix here in California, but you should be able to find it pretty much anywhere, and it's relatively cheap. It's under 30 bucks, I think. So I wanted to try a whiskey that is a good introduction whiskey for people who are just getting started and don't want to break the bank on a whiskey. Now, there's a lot in this label. Just it's saying Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey has a lot to break down here. Now, Buffalo Trace is in fact named after the distillery, the Buffalo Trace Distillery. It went by a lot of names, and it's self-proclaimed to be the longest or oldest continually running distillery in the US. I think it was founded in 1787. And they produce a lot of other whiskeys as well, not just Buffalo Trace, including Sazerac, E.H. Taylor, Eagle Rare, George T. Stagg. All the Pappies come from Buffalo Trace. Now let's break down the label here, besides just the name Buffalo Trace. Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey. So for it to be Kentucky whiskey, it has to be made in Kentucky. So fermented, distilled, matured in Kentucky. Straight bourbon whiskey. So bourbon has to be fermented from at least 51% corn. This is not to be confused with corn whiskey, which must be fermented from at least 80% corn. Yeah, the US has a lot of confusing classes that fall under the whiskey category that I could talk a lot about. Now, straight means it must be matured, it must be aged in new charred American oak barrels for at least 2 years. If there's no age statement on it, it has to be at least 4 years. This in particular, the mash bill, so what they use for the fermentation is a low rye mash bill for Buffalo Trace. So that means it's about less than 10% rye in the mash, and the remainder is corn. And it also must be, when it's distilled, must be distilled to less than 80% ABV. 80% alcohol by volume. So the reason they do that is that keeps a lot of the nuances that come from the fermentation in the whiskey. So you're able to actually taste all those characteristics of the whiskey. I'm not sure exactly how this is distilled. Each bourbon distillery has their own procedure for distillation, usually involving a combination of pot and column stills, or doublers, things like that. If you have any questions, I can really dive deep into that. And when it's matured, when it's aged, it can't be aged at higher than 62.5% ABV in the barrel. Cool. Let's see if there's anything else that I wanted to include in that. No, I think that's it. So let's dive in, let's try it. Now, bourbons are known for having a lot of flavor to them. You can see how dark this is for something that is not necessarily that old. Using new charred barrels gives you a lot of color. There's a lot of wood breakdown that comes from using new barrels, whereas like if you look at a Scotch or an Irish whiskey, they're much lighter. They almost always used pre-used barrels. So a lot of those tannins, a lot of those polyphenols are extracted from the wood, and there's more of a mellow maturation. With bourbons though, using brand new barrels, there's a lot of activity that's happening as it's maturing. So there's a lot of color buildup. So also using charred American oak will give you a lot more notes of caramel. You'll also pick up vanilla, and bourbon will tend to have a little bit of, some people call it nail polish remover notes to it. I like to think of it as more floral notes that you're getting, but bourbons do have a very distinct flavor profile. And this is a pretty classic bourbon. So yeah, we'll dive into the nose again, spend some time with this one. So you'll get some pepperiness that's coming through. With bourbons and ryes, with American whiskeys, I typically always get a little bit of like that pickliness right off the bat. But you'll be able to smell some fruity notes in there, definitely some caramels and some vanillas. Ooh, maybe even some butterscotch in there as well. But yeah, spend some time, nose this. Again, it's 45% alcohol. The alcohol will come to you. You don't have to shove your nose in there and you know, zap your nose hairs. The flavors are very delicious. So there's a lot of flavor to this. The mouthfeel is not as rich as I kind of want it, but I don't really mind because of all those flavors that are there. So again, I'm getting some pepperiness, I'm getting vanilla and caramel and toffee. There's definitely a fruit in there. I can't tell if it's like a really sweet mandarin orange. But yeah, some definitely lingering honey, for sure. It's a delicious whiskey, something you should definitely pick up. And if you're not into drinking bourbon straight at all, definitely making it into or using it for cocktails is great. Add a little bit of ginger ale. That's about all I can tell you. I'm not a bartender. But yeah. So this is Buffalo Trace, Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey. Thanks, guys.